So my name is Sean Larkin. I am talking to you from Revival.
Hey all, Amanda here, and welcome to episode 88 of Great Beer Adventure. I still have a number of breweries to tell you about down in New York, but I wanted to pause on those for a moment to chat with a great gent from Rhode Island. One thing I've learned is that the best way to find people to chat with is to jump on social media. Come find me on Instagram at Great Beer Adventure, and we can share more amazing beer stories there. While Sean and I first connected on social media, I waited until we spoke in person to find out the origin story of Revival Brewing.
So when we started this building in 2013, I consulted and built Brewtopia to be a standalone restaurant that would potentially get franchised. And then about 6 months into it, the owner wanted to integrate Revival as a distribution component to the business. And then eventually we took over financial responsibility of the brewery and staffing of the brewery staff. And now we essentially run the brewery part of the business. And so we partner on the beer side of things, and the owner basically runs the kitchen in front of the house. So Brewtopia was basically a strip mall bar that used to be called Sharks. And there was 3 different businesses that were in this sort of facility. It's about 5,000 square feet upstairs, then another 5,000 square feet downstairs. And the owner had basically had dreams of starting a brew pub. He had been to Canada, he had been to places around the United States and wanted to create something, but he wasn't really sure what he wanted to create. So we talked about his needs, his desires, and from a consulting point of view, we talked about what different concepts were around as far as, brew pubs and restaurants. And really, the last thing that anybody needed in Rhode Island was another Irish pub-themed brew pub. So barbecue was a severely underserviced market in 2013. So we sort of steered it into the direction of doing barbecue. I really wanted to make this place a destination place. Obviously, a lot of places survive on, local presence to keep their doors open. But obviously with beer and barbecue, there's a certain nomadic sense or a nomadic customer base, meaning people will travel to get barbecue in Memphis. They'll travel to get barbecue in Texas. They'll do it in St. Louis. And they'll also do the same for beer. Obviously, people travel all over the place for beer. So we figured that, with the real estate that we had and the size of this place, that we could really sort of become a destination spot for the Northeast. And I think, we're 90% there. Obviously, every restaurant has, or every brewery has its room for improvement. But, we won Best Brew Pub 2 years in a row. We've won a bunch of, awards for beer and barbecue as well. So we're doing really well compared to what people thought. I think that in the beginning, when I told people that I was going to open a brewery in Cranston, Rhode Island, that they were like, that's crazy. That's the suburbs. Nobody's going to come there. And it's actually the reverse. If you talk to a lot of our customer base, they're from Cranston, they're from Warwick, they're from Coventry, they're from Uxbridge, Massachusetts, they're from Blackstone, Mass. And they love coming here because they don't have to go into the city. There's a lot of challenges with, going into Providence. I love Providence. It's my favorite place. It's where I live. But the suburbs definitely deserve something awesome like this. And I was very happy to be a part of doing that. And I was very happy to prove people wrong. One of my greatest attributes is when people tell me I can't do something and then I actually do it. We've basically built like a business that does about $1.5 million in sales a year. So it's certainly not a failure by any means. Rhode Island is really funny. You'll still talk to people that are like, oh, I've never heard of that place, or I don't go to Cranston. Like, are you guys even doing well over there? And we're like, yeah, we're actually doing really well. Like last year we did about 3,000 barrels worth of production, which is actually a really good number. And I think, for a brand that perceivably is not necessarily first and foremost on everybody's internet choice of brands to blog about or brands to like brag about. We sell a ton of beer over here, so we're actually doing really good. So I'm happy about it.
Now on to a couple of beers that they make.
Sure. So I will talk about White Electric Coffee Stout, and then I will choose to talk about the Fanny Session IPA. So back in the early start of Revival, we had sort of transitioned from me being a brewer at Trinity Brewhouse. I know you interviewed Tommy. That's sort of my roots. That's where I came from. I had also consulted for the folks at Narragansett Brewing Company. And so in the first couple of years of Revival being a company, we were going for more eclectic and high end. So we started with a Saison. We started with Double Black IPA. We started with Hefeweizen, and we started with an Imperial Oktoberfest. And everybody had been sort of, pushing us to come out with an IPA. But since I had been incubating my brand out of Trinity Brewhouse, I was slow to challenge their IPA recipe just with another commercial beer. So when we finally did outgrow what we could do at Trinity and moved over to this facility, I conceptualized Fanny Session IPA, which was slightly different from the IPAs that Trinity was doing and the IPAs that Narragansett was doing. So it was a good launch into that territory, and it wasn't, like a direct hit on what they were going to do. I think sometimes people become loyalists about what they like about beer, like how, what IPA is the best? Oh, and you've given me 4 choices now, and now my mind is blown. I don't know what to drink, So, Fanny was a good sort of, segue into us doing a bunch of different new IPAs. Founders was coming out at the time. I think there were a few other session IPAs that were also coming out at the time. So Fanny is basically a grain bill that has British and German specialty malts in it. And then we use an American-based malt in it, but we use Mosaic, Citra, and Galaxy hops in that beer. And it's roughly about 3 pounds per barrel of hops in that beer. So it's about 4.7 as a target ABV and just right around 55 IBUs. But it's nice and crisp and refreshing. It's not super overpowering. So I feel like we've hit the mark on that. So one of the things that I feel really strongly about is, like honoring local collaborations. When we started at Trinity, we were working with the folks at White Electric. I played kickball with Tom and those folks in the Providence Kickball League. And so we started buying coffee beans and sort of working on White Electric over there. When I started Revival at Trinity, White Electric was definitely on the docket of beers to brew. So we started doing it in draft first, and then we actually put it into bottles 2 years ago in July. So it was kind of funny, our distributor was really confused. He was like, I don't know why you guys would come out with a coffee stout during the middle of the summer. He's like, it's probably not going to sell a lot. And then we sold like 700 cases in our first month. And it's pretty awesome. It's right up there as one of our flagships. I think we did about 250 barrels of coffee stout last year. White Electric, again, is really eclectic, small coffee house. The roast of coffee is actually called Hello Darkness, and they work with the folks over at New Harvest to roast that blend for them. It's a small coffee house that's right in the heart of the city. There's musicians, professors, police officers, students, artists that all sort of get their coffee and their daily nourishment there in the morning. And it's also a very cool hangout, and those guys have really created a diverse culture of people hanging out in their shop, and they always make people feel welcome, and it's a homegrown business. So we're psyched to be able to partner with those guys. The Gorilla, who was actually sort of a derivative of King Kong, was actually used by White Electric before we ever adopted it. And it, obviously is a representation of their brand. And we've sort of stylized it and took it one step further and turned it into a hipster Gorilla. And then we also have a spin-off beer that is a derivative of that beer called the Hole Mole Mexican Coffee Stout. And that Gorilla has Day of the Dead paint on him. So, we're sort of, expanding on that idea a little bit. But along the way, we're still paying homage to the folks at White Electric. And then with the Hole Mole, paying homage to the folks over at El Rancho Grande, which is another notorious local eatery that people love in Providence. So it's about building connections and working with people that support you and, trying to sort of build a story so that when somebody from out of town comes in, they're like, oh, what are these, hopefully the thought is they're like, oh, what are these cool places and, that are associated with this brand. So, if they're out of state and they're drinking Revival, now they want to check out White Electric Coffee, but then they also want to check out, El Rancho Grande. So if we become a further vehicle for advertising for those companies, I think we've done our job.
Let's find out a bit more about where you can find Revival's beers.
Well, technically, we are the biggest international distributor of beverages to Japan, but that's because we are the only distributor of Rhode Island goods to Japan in the way of beverages. So we are in New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and again, Japan. We were approached by an MIT student who had two friends that were basically starting a craft beer distributorship in Japan, a very small craft beer distributorship. It wasn't anything, giant craft, house where they wanted thousands and thousands of cases. We routinely sell them about 2 pallets of beer every quarter. So they'll basically put a wish list in of things that they've read about us on the internet doing. And, we have an order that's going to go out next week to them. That's probably got about 18 kegs worth of beer, maybe about 70 or 80 cases. So it'll be about 2 pallets. They actually air freight it instead of it being on a boat. So we can sell them stuff that's fresh and then get it to Japan within a 2-week period. So it's not like it's sitting in customs and just dying in customs. And it's really cool. I choose to talk about them, not because I want to discount any of our other distribution relationships, but just because it's kind of mind-blowing to me to wake up in the morning and see like 6 or 7 posts from people in Japan drinking our stuff, or like being out at a party or being at a small bar in Japan serving Revival. I never would have thought in a million years that would have been something that was possible. I think it's totally cool. They've done 2 Skype interviews with us, which is really weird, to Skype in and then them turn around and show you your face on a giant video screen in somebody's apartment, which was really kind of fun at the same time. And, it's just interesting to have distribution partners that far away.
And as always, we certainly must know Sean's first beer memory.
So there's 2. I'll give you my first beer memory, and then I'll give you my first craft beer memory. So in 1977, because I'm old, my grandparents moved to Indiana, and they lived at this dead-end street and they had a swimming pool in the neighborhood. So, of course, the house was the hot spot. So I think 77, I was 4 years old, and then I had spent a bunch of summers over the next couple of years. But the summer that I was 7, I spent out there, and the neighborhood had different scales of ages, meaning like I was a 7-year-old hanging out with a friend that was 10. His brother was 13. His 13-year-old brother was friends with another kid at the end of the street, Steve, who was 17. And at that time, the drinking age in Ohio was 17. So Steve would drive from Bloomington, Indiana to Ohio and grab a case of beer and actually store it like in this little cave area in the backwoods. And then the kids in the woods would we'd swing on vines and raise hell and drink beer. Not so much me at 7, but the teenage kids. And since, you're living in a dead end street, you're around there. So there was one particular day that, everybody else was at their tail end of school, and I decided that I was just going to go in the woods and have myself a beer at 7 years old. And, they also introduced me to chewing tobacco at 7 years old. So, here I am thinking I'm, out in the woods doing this, adult stuff. I think I made it through half of a Coors Light and a little bit of chewing tobacco before I started to turn green and feel sick. I wandered back to my grandparents' house, and I remember my grandfather coming out of the house and just shaking his head and knowing what I had done, because probably he saw chewing tobacco in my teeth and I'm sure something dripping down my face. And he was like, you want to be a man? Well, I'm going to punish you like a man. Why don't you go upstairs and pull your pants down or something like that? And so I ran upstairs, and I think I passed out for like 6 hours or something like that and woke up. And that was my first experience of drinking a beer. My first experience of drinking a craft beer was probably around when I was 18. The guy that lived next door to me was a big fan of Sierra Nevada and Long Trail. So they were very new to New England. When I was 18, it would have been like 1990. So those are the first craft beers that I remember. I used to drink Black and Voodoo. I drank Sierra Nevada Pale. I drank Long Trail. And there might have been like some other really pretend craft beers back then that were around in Rhode Island, like Red Dog and some other stuff that like Miller was trying to do. But that was my first. And then, of course, like bottled Guinness was like the first thing. And then 2 years later, I started working at Trinity Brewhouse, and I was literally a cook who was working in the kitchen, and the brewery was being built. And I was like, wow, this is pretty cool. I'm like, oh, this is great. Oh, they do stuff in there? Oh, they make beer? Like, I just had no concept where that part of my life would take me. And I just became friends with the guys that were the brewers there. And then eventually the head brewer fired his brother because they fought all the time. So he fired his brother one day and peeked his head out of the kitchen and was like, hey, you want to brew beer? And I was like, yeah. He's like, okay, you start tomorrow. And I was like, all right. And then that's pretty much how my career started. So I like to tell it that way because it's a funny story to tell that way. You know, a lot of people, I think, in the beginning of my career were really jealous and pissed off. And I think what's important to tell is back then, I think there was probably only 1,300 breweries in the country at that time, maybe. Maybe it was 1,300 or 2,300, something like that. It was a very small number. And there wasn't a lot in Rhode Island. There was Trinity, Union Station, Coddington hadn't even opened yet. I think there was Emerald Isle. And, you know, most of the guys that were like homebrewing beer were like in their, 40s. So here's this snot-nosed 21-year-old like in charge of, the newest brew pub in Providence. And that was certainly something that was like a blow to their homebrewing egos because they were like, this kid hasn't even lived long enough to brew beer. And now he's, running this place. And I think, the merits of success to running that place were that I didn't have any preconceived notions of beer. I basically worked on brewing things that were stylistically inherent of what should have been served at a brew pub, meaning, when we started off, we had Kolsch, brown ale, red ale, Irish stout, Russian stout, and IPA. And then, from there, we would rotate in one style over the month. So over the 17 years that I was at Trinity, we did things from double box to quads to, raspberry stouts to the notorious, Belgian strawberry ale that I've heard Tommy tell you about. And that was pretty much a mistake. Tommy and I came in one day, we were supposed to brew like a light strawberry beer for the summertime. And we had run out of hot water. And when you run out of hot water, you run the risk of like pulling off flavors or the beer not being right. So we were like, you know what, let's just make a, super high-end strawberry beer. So we literally just like made this 12% beer, threw a ton of strawberries into it, and it literally became this cult favorite that I'm sure Tommy told you about, and I'm sure that people in Providence still talk about. There was one notorious story about a kid coming in, drinking like 2 pints of it, and then like throwing up on the doors as he was trying to like get outside during the summertime. And not that I want people to be overserved, but I think it was just one of those things where ultimately people see strawberry and they're like, oh, it must be a girly beer. And we're like, yeah, sure, bro. Go ahead, take that on. We'll see what happens. And then it's certainly a beer that teaches people lessons. So anyway.
Yeah, that's it. That's all I got for you.
Well, thanks.
Thank you so much to Sean for meeting with me and sharing his story. And a huge thank you to you all. You are the very best. Please remember to share us with your friends. I am sure you have figured out by now that I love meeting new people. Head over to greatbeeradventure.com/podcast to see what Justin has put together for you. Until next time, get out there and try something new. Chat soon, friends. If you all, our fabulous co-adventurers, would like to support the show, check out our Patreon page. For less than the cost of a beer, you can show us some love. Go to greatbeeradventure.com/support. If you want to see even more from our adventures, follow us on Instagram @GreatBeerAdventure. And be sure to subscribe to the show. That way, you won't miss a thing. Great Beer Adventure, is part of the Great Pint Society. Cheers.